Now, Burt Wolder has been a Sherlockian for almost 50 years.
No.
And he doesn't look
cannot.
older than 52.
I cannot.
Now, in November 1975, he was a member of the Cornish Horrors in Connecticut, and he performed as Professor Moriarty
Yeah.
in a one-act play, Windmill's End, in which he also wrote.
Sure, I know that.
Now, he's the third pillar from the left in the Baker Street Irregulars, class of 1988. He's intervals of note-taking and of meditation
Oh, I gotta do my own.
in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And 17 years ago, he joined Scott Monty as co-host of the podcast I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now, for many years, they've finished 17 years of this podcast. There's always a one-question quiz that everybody is challenged to write, send in your answers. And Burt has achieved a record of never having answered the quiz correctly. Burt claims he is a retired panhandler,
Yeah.
but actually he worked for many years for AT&T and marketing and advertising in the United States and Europe. And this is back in the years when you paid by the minute for long distance calls. And Burt was a treasure because his business cards had a code that gave you 10 or 20 free minutes of long distance calling. And of course, people used them up and didn't keep them. So if you still have a supply, it's long distance. Burt is going to talk to us about Arthur Conan Doyle, who many of us have heard of. The BSI like to refer to him as the literary agent, but we do that still just because it annoyed the hell out of Adrian Conan Doyle. So, Burt Wolder.
Oh, thank you, Randy. Thank you.
Oh,
Great speech.
Fabulous. So it's a great thing to be here to talk to you about Arthur Conan Doyle. And if anything, this talk is sort of a tribute to Dan Stashower, who's one of the members here, who isn't here today. But Doug has a copy of Dan's book. So if you're in the market for reading a biography of Conan Doyle, of all the ones that have been written, I think, the ne plus ultra here is Dan Stashower's. Just a terrific book. So the deal here is that in 1929, Conan Doyle suffered a heart attack. And in 1930, sadly, in July, he would have another one, which would kill him. But in the interval, in early 1930, he struggles to his writing desk and drew this picture, which is what you have in your handout. And the nice part about your handout is you have a key, thanks to the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia here. But it's called The Old Horse. And he would print copies of this and send it to his well-wishers and say that, well, I think I actually put it on the handout, that with great care, 6 months rest and 6 months grass, the old horse would soon be on the road again. And so what you have here is, at the bottom it says, consultation of vets, Webb, Johnson, Parkinson, and McIntosh. The old horse has pulled a heavy load a long way, but he's well cared for, and with 6 weeks stable and 6 months grass, he'll be on the road once more. And you have all these boxes on the old horse's wagon. 500 lectures, psychic research, historical novels, drama, the Congo, George Adalji, and one of the large ones here, of course, is Sherlock Holmes. So let me just remove my folder here. So I looked at this and I said to myself, what a life. Could we learn something from Doyle's baggage cart? Something that could help us about how to make memorable moments in our own lives. And that's really what I want to talk to you about now. And so let's zoom in on some of these packing cases. And as I do so, I want to use as much as possible Conan Doyle's own words. So Conan Doyle was born May 22nd, 1859, at 11 Picardy Place in Edinburgh. It's about 1 mile from the university where he would go to medical school, along with Robert Louis Stevenson, by the way. He was the second child of Charles and Mary Doyle. He's the second child, and the second of 9 children, of whom 7 survived. So death and the mortality rate in Edinburgh in the 19th century is part of the fabric, part of the surround of Conan Doyle. His great uncle Michael Conan was a distinguished journalist and author, and his elder sister Annette, who was the firstborn, get the compound surname of Conan Doyle. In 1855, his father Charles had married a 17-year-old Mary Foley, the granddaughter of his landlady. She was a lively, well-educated woman. Her love of books made a lasting impression on her son. And she had this gift. He said she had this born storyteller's gift of sinking her voice to a horror-stricken whisper when she reached the crisis of a story. And he wrote in Memories and Adventures, his memoir, in my early childhood, as far back as I can remember anything at all, the vivid stories which she would tell me stand out so clearly that they obscure the real facts of my life. So Mary Doyle was fascinated by the traditions of chivalry and captivated her children with tales of knights and their quests. And there's a scene in Sir Nigel, one of Conan Doyle's historical novels, where Sir Nigel and his men sit spellbound as a French noblewoman, the Lady Tiffany, the wife of a famous soldier, spins tales of knightly deeds to a group around a campfire. And here's how he described that. The mind had gone out of them, and they could but look at this woman and listen to the words which fell from her lips, words which thrilled through their nerves and stirred their souls like the battle call of a bugle. That sweet, clear voice, with its high, thrilling talk of the deathlessness of glory, the worthlessness of life, of the pain of ignoble joy, and of the joy which lies in all pains, which lead to a noble end. And still, as the shadows deepened, she spoke of valor, virtue, of loyalty, honor, and fame, and still they sat, drinking in her words, when the fire burned down and the red ash turned to gray. So as a boy, Conan Doyle loved the stories of Mayne Reid, Thomas Mayne Reid. He was an Irish-Scots novelist who had fought in the Mexican-American War, and that provided Conan Doyle with his first taste of the American West. And so when he later comes to the United States on his first tour, and he takes tours through the Rockies, he writes this in his memoir, my goodness, there are the Rockies, my Rockies. The same scene, the same vista he remembered as a boy reading the works of Mayne Reid. At least, he wrote, I have seen my dream mountains. Most boys never do. Mayne Reid was a favorite of Christopher Morley, Anton Chekhov, Vladimir Nabokov, Theodore Roosevelt, among others, this boy's novelist of the 1840s. So Conan Doyle is sent to Hodder, a preparatory school, and then on to Stonyhurst, a Jesuit school in Lancashire, and it was at Stonyhurst that he first realizes he had literary abilities far beyond those of mortal men, and he writes this in his memoir. There was my debut as a storyteller. On a wet half-holiday, I have been elevated onto a desk, and with an audience of little boys all squatting on the floor, with their chins up on their hands, I have talked myself husky over the misfortune of my heroes. Week in and week out, those unhappy men have battled and striven and grown for the amusement of that little circle. I was bribed with pastry. Sometimes, too, I would stop dead in the very thrill of a crisis and could only be set a-going again by apples. When I had got as far as, with his left hand in her glossy locks, he was waving the blood-stained knife above her head, when I knew I had my audience in the power. So it's decided he'll take a medical degree, and he enters Edinburgh University, where his other students included James Barrie of Peter Pan fame. And there are many stories about Dr. Joseph Bell, the surgeon and lecturer who was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. And I won't repeat any of them because you've heard them all. In his third year of medical school, he interrupts his studies to become a ship's doctor on an Arctic whaler. And he graduates and he becomes entangled with Dr. George Budd, half genius and half quack, this extraordinary character who, as Conan Doyle wrote, always telegraphed and never wrote. And there's a lot in George Budd's character, showmanship and other things that turn up later in the character of Sherlock Holmes. So in 1881, he becomes a ship's surgeon on a steamer to Africa, and after that he opens up his practice in South Sea. And he divides his time between writing and practicing as a physician in the South Sea for about 7 years, during which time A Study in Scarlet and much else is published, including his first historical novel, Micah Clarke. And there's clearly a reckless nature in Conan Doyle's character. He makes snap decisions. He joins the crew of an Arctic whaler. He signs on as a ship's surgeon. Equally recklessly, he decides to close his practice in South Sea and become an eye specialist. So he and his wife travel to Vienna, where he finds his schoolboy German isn't good enough for medical studies. And after 3 months in Vienna, he moves to London and sets up as an eye specialist. And after 3 more months where no patient crosses his door, he gives up medicine forever and devotes himself completely to writing. And his wife, Louisa, develops tuberculosis, and they find the climate in Davos in Switzerland beneficial. Conan Doyle had seen ski running. That's what they called it then, ski running in Norway. And he began to promote it as a hobby. And this is what he wrote about it. There is nothing particularly malignant in the appearance of a pair of skis. They are 2 strips of elm wood, 8 feet long, 4 inches broad, with a square heel, turned up toes, and straps in the center to secure your feet. No one, to look at them, would guess the possibilities which lurk in them, but you put them on, and you turn with a smile to see whether your friends are looking at you, and then, the next moment, you are boring your head madly into a snowbank. And kicking frantically with both feet, and half rising, only to butt viciously into that snowbank again. And your friends are getting more entertainment than they had ever thought you capable of delivering. Conan Doyle had at least one success in the theater with a play called Waterloo, which was recommended to the great actor Henry Irving by his business manager, Bram Stoker, who was soon to be the author of Dracula. 3 years later, in 1897, Irving played an old soldier in Napoleon's army, much like Brigadier Gerard, the hero of the Gerard series that Conan Doyle published the same year. His wife, Louisa, struggles with tuberculosis for 13 years, and in 1899, he published an unusual novel, a duet with occasional chorus, which is really a paean to love and romance. And it's the story of a newlywed couple, Frank and Maud, and their struggles and successes. And the book was dedicated to Maud, who was the wife of the story. And she might have been a stand-in for Jean Leckie, whom Conan Doyle had met 2 years before and who would become his second wife. He gave her the bound manuscript. But Maud, in the duet, is a bit of a brick. You know, she is sort of constantly in awe of Frank and explains that she's not very well read, and she hopes that no one more interesting will catch his eye. And Jean Leckie was very accomplished and very well read. There's a scene in Duet, Talk About Knowledge, where they're in Westminster Abbey, and it's a wonderful bit of description, because there's They go on a little tour, and there's an American and a Scotsman, and that's kind of comic. But Maud, in all innocence, says to Frank, "Who owns this? Frank?" And Frank says, "Why, we do, Maud." And she says, "You're joking." And he says, No, it belongs to the nation." Well, I don't think Gene Leckie was quite that kind of guy. But interestingly enough, in the duet, they go to the Church of St. Olaf. There's this marvelous scene where it's the place where Samuel Pepys is buried. And they see the monument to Pepys, and they have this discussion with the verger. And it's got to be a scene that Conan Doyle actually heard, because what happens is the verger tells them that that he's not there where the monument is, he's actually over here, and that they went down there and did some excavation. And the verger says, "Well, miss," because they've seen the body of Pepys. And Pepys's wife is buried on top. She lived 30 more years. Oh no, he died. She died 30 years before he did. And he says, "Well, miss, his coffin lay above and his wife's below, and the coffins was very much broken, and we could see him as clear as I can see you. And when we first looked in, I saw him lying quite plain, a short, thick figure of a man with his hands across his chest. And then just as we looked at him, he crumbled in, as you might say, across his breastbone, and just quietly settled down into a puddle of dust. It's a way, they has, as when the fresh air strikes him. And she the same, and his dust just fell through the chinks of wood and mixed itself with hers." Oh. So that's some of the, and I tell you this because I know, left to your own devices, you are never going to read duet. So Conan Doyle lectured on everything, including Thomas Carlyle, Moses Mendelssohn, the Shakespearean stage, the style of William Dean Howells and Henry James, foreign words in the English language, the genius of George Meredith, the Eiffel Tower, similarities between Ibsen and Tolstoy, and much more. And he was a great reader and wrote essays about the contents of his library, Through the Magic Door in 1906. He goes shelf by shelf. He has opinions about every volume. And he's fulsome about his debt to Poe. And Conan Doyle was also a poet. He had written poetry continuously since his school days, and one of them was a comic poem called Bendy's Sermon. Now, the interesting thing is that Conan Doyle owed his readership, George Newnes owed his readership for the Strand magazine, to the Compulsory Education Act that was passed in Britain in the 1860s, 1850s. And the poem, Bendy's Sermon, is about a grandfather whose grandson is not working on the farm, he's off to school. And he says, "Well, I teach you in that school anyway." And boy tells him, and then he says, "Did they ever tell you about Bendigo?" And the boy says, No. Well, Bendy's Sermon is the story of a prize fighter turned preacher named Bendigo. And his fighting instincts return when hecklers interrupt his sermon. So that's the premise. He's a prize fighter turned preacher, and hecklers, his old pals, interrupt his sermon. And here's just 6 lines from this poem. "He vaulted from the pulpit like a tiger from a den. They said it was a lovely sight to see him floor his men. Platt was standing on his back and looking at his toes. Solly Jones of Perry Bar was feeling for his nose. Connor of the Bull Ring had all that he could do, rake in for his ivories that lay about the pew." Isn't that great? It's sort of a piece with Casey and the Bat, it should come out a few years earlier. So it was natural for Conan Doyle, even at 40, to enlist in the army during the Second Boer War, but he was too old and untrained, and luckily a friend of his was equipping a hospital to send to South Africa, and Conan Doyle became the supervisor. And he had the time of his life, despite the deplorable conditions, the terrible disease, the hundreds of wounded they treated. He stood for Parliament twice and failed, and in time he thought he was much better off to have lost. He hated electioneering, and he wrote extensively about it in 1924. It's a vile, can you imagine this, Conan Doyle running for office and having to take questions from people who opposed him? It's a vile business, this electioneering, though no doubt it is chastening in its effects. They say that mud baths are healthy and purifying, and I can compare it to nothing else. So his memories of notable people included royalty, American presidents, British politicians, and authors. P.G. Wodehouse, who was then a reporter, interviewed him after his ascent in a hot air balloon. And here is how Conan Doyle remembered his first meeting, what he describes as his first meeting with Arthur Balfour, who was then Prime Minister of England. So he's in a house in the country. He's been invited there by Lord Burnham. And he writes, Lord Burnham's hobby was Turkish baths. And he had an excellent one in the front of the house. Now, a Turkish bath is just this 3 stages where you go through steam and bathing and cooling. Lord Burnham's hobby was Turkish baths. He had an excellent one in the front of the house. The drying room being the first door on the right as one entered. First door on the right. With his usual kind hospitality, Lord Burnham had urged me to try his bath. And having done so, I was placed, arrayed in a long towel, and with another towel screwed round my head, in the drying room. And presently the door opened, and entered Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister of England. He knew nothing of the house or its ways, and I can remember the amazement with which he gazed at me. Lord Burnham, following at his heels, introduced me, and I raised the towel on my head. There were no explanations, and I felt that he went away with the impression that this was my usual costume. So, he'd been, in the First World War, Conan Doyle is again eager to enlist. He becomes a private in the Home Guard Volunteers, and when he is asked by the Foreign Office to write favorable publicity for the Italian army, he turned it into an opportunity to visit the British, Italian, and French fronts. But what to wear? Well, he'd been knighted by this time and named Deputy Lieutenant of Surrey, which gave him the right to wear a uniform with the troops. I went straight off to my tailor, who rigged me up a wondrous khaki garb, which was something between that of a colonel and a brigadier, with silver roses instead of stars or crowns upon the shoulder straps. As I had the right to wear several medals, including the South African, the general effect was all right, but I always felt a mighty imposter, though it was certainly very comfortable and convenient. I was still a rare specimen, and quite a number of officers of 3 nations made inquiry about my silver roses. A deputy lieutenant may not be much in England, but when translated into French, my French anyhow, it had an awe-inspiring effect. And I was looked upon then as an inscrutable, but very big person, with a uniform all his own. So he writes another book, A Visit to 3 Fronts. Over the years in the Sudan and the Boer War and the World War, Conan Doyle kept up a constant stream of suggestions to improve the lives and safety of the men. He argued for the use of camouflage. He recommended better artillery placement, a democratic, less class-conscious military. He recommended constructing a channel tunnel to avoid a blockade by sea. He spoke about the danger from submarines in wartime. He campaigned for body armor for frontline soldiers. His petitions for flotation collars and rafts for sailors led to the first life jackets. So the war brought enormous tragedy to Conan Doyle. He lost his brother, his son, 2 brothers-in-law, and 2 nephews in World War I. And then came the armistice. And here's how Conan Doyle remembered it. And then at last came the blessed day of armistice, the 11th hour of the 11th month and the 11th day. I was in a staid London hotel at 11 o'clock in the morning, the most prim of all the hours in a day, when a lady, well-dressed and conventional, came through the turning doors, waltzed, slowly around the room with a flag in either hand, and then departed without saying a word. It was the first sign things were happening. I rushed out into the streets, and of course the news was everywhere at once. I walked down to Buckingham Palace and saw the crowds assembled there, singing and cheering. A slim young girl got elevated onto some high vehicle and was leading and conducting the singing as if she was an angel in tweeds just dropped from a cloud. On the whole, the people were very good and orderly. They say that it was when the Australian wounded met the War Office flappers that the foundations of solid old London got loosened. But we have little to be ashamed of, and if ever folks rejoiced, we surely had the right to do so. We did not see the new troubles ahead of us, but at least these old ones were behind, and we gained an immense reassurance. Britain had not weakened. She was still the Britain of old. So it seems to me that there's a lesson in the life of Arthur Conan Doyle that's worth thinking about. And I don't know about you, but when I consider what my life sketch would be, my workhorse and my packing crates, my wagon seems a lot lighter than Conan Doyle's. When I think of my life and my memories, I don't see packing cases or a horse or a wagon. I see Conan Doyle had many events and accomplishments to recall, but he also made great memories. How did he do that? Could we follow his example and create our own lasting memories? Well, what did he do? Well, it seems to me he did three things. He had a knack for creating moments of elevation, moments of great sensory appeal. An Arctic whaler telling stories around a fire, strapping on skis. He seems to have gone out of his way to raise the stakes by some of his decisions, becoming an eye specialist, leaving Portsmouth, betting on George Budd, who left him penniless, by the way. And the second thing that he did is he celebrated moments of pride. His first published article, his first novel, his triumphs in cricket. When he pitched against the legendary W.R. Grace and got him out, he wrote a poem about it. Research shows that telling things to other people improves recall. And he built moments of connection with other people. Much of his life involved struggle. He became the family breadwinner. He brought his younger brother Innes to Southsea in the early days of his medical practice. He struggled with James Barrie on an unsuccessful play. He struggled with Arthur Sullivan on an opera. He campaigned for innovations in the military when nobody really wanted to know what he thought. Working with other people, particularly on something meaningful, bonds us together. And there are lessons that we might all benefit from, not just in looking back on our own lives, but in making new memories. And that brings me to my last question. Why is it in the second decade of the 21st century we still find Arthur Conan Doyle interesting? Perhaps it's because of the contrasts. We live in an age of amnesia. He honored the past. Ours is a society of texts and T-shirts, but he was ink and paper, corduroy and tweed. Our world sometimes seems to run on ignorance, but Conan Doyle was well-read, thoughtful, and informed on any number of topics. He was the soul of knight-errantry. In his day, he was a reassuring presence. The writer Christopher Morley once self-described tincture of Conan Doyle when he was ill and in bed. Well, I think that's a great prescription. And if you agree, this is the perfect sign to carry that message forward. Why not the red circle? Look at the examples that we have. And that's why I am so pleased that in our audience, we have Ross Davies, who, among his many other accomplishments, academic and in publishing, is also the leader of the Arthur Conan Doyle Society. And so, if you agree, Ross is ready to enlist you on a new long march.